Medical history, the advance to the Aisne, September 1914. In early September 1914, after weeks of retreat, the British Expeditionary Force turned north and began its advance towards the Aisne. This movement, often overshadowed by combat narratives, placed an enormous strain on the medical services. Field ambulances had to keep pace with rapidly moving divisions, operate on congested roads, evacuate wounded under fire, and adapt constantly to shifting orders and broken communications. What follows is the story of how the medical services of the 1st, 2nd and 3rd Corps coped with that challenge. And we're looking at this slide here, we can see down the bottom left where the British Expeditionary Force is, i.e. just to the east of Paris. So starting with the 1st Corps medical services, who were actually on the right hand side of the BEF's frontage. On 6th of September, the 1st Division's field ambulances were positioned near Pompiers, south of Rozoy, and as the division fought a heavy rearguard action, wounded began arriving rapidly from midday onwards. The bearer division stayed forward with the brigades, collecting casualties under fire, but the 10th Divisions worked further back, operating dressing stations and treating the wounded as they arrived. By early evening, evacuation was becoming urgent. Motor lorries were brought forward to clear the dressing stations, with ambulance wagons ferrying casualties back along the line. Despite limited transport and poor roads, most wounded were cleared that night, only a handful too unfit to move. By late evening and into the night, Field Ambulance No. 1 and 3 had moved forward to Verdun. No. 2 remained behind with the wounded until the following evening before rejoining the division. On the 8th of September, the division crossed the Grand Morin and Petit Morin rivers, the field ambulances halting briefly to reorganise. This was an essential pause used to rebalance loads and ensure bearer divisions could operate independently if separated from their 10th Divisions. From this point, the advance became more fluid. 10th Divisions no longer moved together. Instead, they leapfrogged forward, one moving while another remained to treat and evacuate casualties. Bearer divisions stayed close to the fighting brigades. This system allowed continuous medical coverage, but it did stretch the field ambulances over long distances. By the night of the 9th of September, they were spread across nearly 15 miles. As fighting intensified near Collincamps, road congestion became one of the greatest obstacles. Field ambulances attempting to move forward found that the narrow roads were jammed with divisional transport, and that supply columns were blocking access to forward positions, and therefore short distances take hours to traverse. One unit took 5.5 hours to cover just 2 miles. Despite this, the dressing stations were opened as soon as possible, and wounded were collected and held until evacuation could resume. Supply lorries were again used to move casualties back to the railhead, highlighting the growing dependence on motor transport. By the 11th and the 12th of September, hundreds of sick and wounded were concentrated at Collincamps and evacuated by supply lorries. Dressing stations were opening in churches and villages as the divisions advanced. Sections of field ambulances were deliberately left behind to clear accumulated casualties within the rest, while the rest moved forward. And by the 13th of September, as the division forced the passage of the Aisne, medical units were split between clearing the rear and supporting the forward advance, and also organising evacuation to ambulance trains, which had resumed now that rail access was possible. Looking at the 2nd Corps, who were to the left of the 1st Corps, they had suffered heavy losses and were reduced in strength. They however advanced, retracing much of its earlier retreat route. Medical units faced additional challenges. One of its 3 field ambulances had been almost destroyed earlier in the campaign, escaping with only a fraction of its personnel and transport. And across the division there were severe shortages in medical officers, orderlies and vehicles. Despite this, medical services continued to function through improvisation and rear reinforcement. And whilst fighting near the rivers on the 8th and the 10th of September, particularly heavy fighting occurred at the Petit Morin and in River Aisne. Now the picture we've just seen here is a pre-war picture of the town hall, and this is a post-war picture of the church, or the remains of the church. But the heavy fighting also occurred around the approaches to the Marne. Advanced dressing stations were opened in farms, cafes, churches and even open fields. Bearer squads often worked well into the night, carrying wounded for miles when wagons could not reach them. Now, casualties didn't just include a large number of the British wounded, but also significant numbers of German wounded who had been captured were also treated and evacuated. One incident illustrates the fragility of the evacuation system. Wounded were having to be sent forward to a supply refilling point before supply lorries had been unloaded, and this caused a transport blockage, delaying both evacuation of the casualties and also resupply of forward units. And this episode highlights a critical tension. Medical evacuation relying on the same transport network as ammunition supplies, and coordination failures which could affect both. So the 3rd Corps, which was the left of the 3 corps, was fighting at the Marne crossings, and they faced intense combat while trying to cross. Now, as always, the medical units collected wounded under machine gun fire, and in this corps' case, there was some actual street fighting as well. They evacuated casualties from chateaus and crossroads that had become makeshift hospitals, and they continued operating despite roads being swept by enemy fire. Now, all field ambulance using the collecting and treating across the frontage of the corps, and the 10th and the 12th field ambulances, which come from the 4th Division, actually set up at the Chateau Perouse, which is the modern day picture here. Now, amongst the casualties were even senior commanders. Major General Snow, who was in charge of the 4th Division, was injured when his horse fell on him. I think he broke his pelvis, actually. So, after crossing the Marne, 3rd Corps medical units endured the long, exhausting marches before reaching the Aisne. And by the 12th to the 13th of September, field ambulances were positioned to support assaults on the Aisne river crossings. Bearer subdivisions had been pushed forward in anticipation of night attacks and assaults. Now, the medical services were once again at the limit of endurance, but were still functioning. And the image we've got here just shows the kind of the ground over which they were working, and hopefully you can see some of the relief of that ground there. The advanced aim was not just a test of infantry and artillery, it was a severe test of medical organisation, looking at the casualties that have been found across the battlefield. And across all 3 corps, field ambulances adapted to fluid warfare, used motor transport as often as they could. It was starting to become essential. And despite roads, rivers and logistics often causing a great problem, they carried on going, and there's an argument that actually the roads, rivers and logistics were a bigger problem to the work of the medical staff than the enemy were. But they kept going. The medical services ensured that thousands of wounded men were treated, stabilised and evacuated, often under fire and with minimal resources. This was modern warfare and modern military medicine taking shape in real time.